Hi class, my name is Doug Ashlock and this is my presentation video for hypoxia for this week's discussion board. I'll go over the four general types of hypoxia, the typical symptoms, as well as remedies, both preemptive and reactive. To understand hypoxia, we have to understand, or rather, to understand hypoxia at altitude, we need to understand the concept of partial pressure. So to understand that as we go up in the atmosphere, the percentage of the gases contained in the atmosphere remain the same. It's the same percentage. It's still 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. And then as we go up, the pressure decreases, so those gases expand because of Boyle's law. Less pressure, more volume. And when we have more volume per cubic measurement, there's less molecules of each type of gas in that one given measurement, but not in the container, which there is no container except for the atmosphere itself. So if we were to take a sample of a ping pong ball size of air and measure that at the ground versus in the atmosphere up above the tropopause, then we would encounter the same percentages of gases, but there would be a less molecules by physical number at that higher altitude. And because of that, there's less oxygen to be had for your body at that altitude. Partial pressure means the same percentages but less molecules at altitude, and that's because of, or that's important because of Fick's law, which is molecules move from areas of high concentration to low. So if you're at a higher altitude, low pressure, there's less oxygen molecules, less concentration at that higher altitude, and the molecules that you have in your blood won't pull those as readily from the air, and that affinity that your hemoglobin has will not be as strong because the number of molecules in the air isn't a high concentration. So the four different types of hypoxia are hypoxic hypoxia, hypemic hypoxia, stagnant hypoxia, and histotoxic hypoxia. And I'll get to fulminating hypoxia in a minute. Hypoxic hypoxia is typically found for aviators in an environment where there's a decreased amount of oxygen, higher altitudes. So there's less ability for your body to breathe the oxygen because there's less oxygen to be had in the atmosphere. Hypemic hypoxia is the blood's inability to properly absorb the oxygen. So the oxygen in the environment is sufficient, but for some reason, one way or another, your blood isn't absorbing it to diffuse it to your body. Stagnant hypoxia is the inability of the body to properly circulate the blood that has the oxygen in it because there's oxygen in the atmosphere. Histotoxic hypoxia is the cell's inability to use or receive the oxygen from the properly circulated oxygen-infused blood. So fulminating hypoxia, like the slide says, is technically a form of hypoxic hypoxia in that it pulls oxygen out of your blood to the atmosphere because of the principles of Fick's law. You have a higher concentration in your blood, particularly in a decompression event. You'll have a higher concentration in your blood than what's outside, and then your body's instantaneously or over a very short duration, up to 10 seconds, you're exposed to this really high altitude, and therefore the high concentration of oxygen in your blood moves to the low concentration in the atmosphere, and it actually will reduce your time of useful consciousness by a third all the way up to a half. So that's pretty important. That's why whenever you're in a commercial flight, they say put your oxygen mask on before you help others, and that's so that you can have oxygen, so you can have that cognitive ability to help other people. This is the table 4-5 from page 46 of our textbook, and I thought this was one of the most inclusive signs and symptoms that I've read from many sources, and so I included it in my presentation. And I think that, everybody experiences hypoxia differently, so it's really important to understand your symptoms. But if you experience any of these symptoms for the first time, you have to immediately be thinking hypoxia, particularly if you're at an altitude where hypoxia is possible. So if you're flying around at 1,000 feet MSL and you're experiencing some of these symptoms, you might be encountering hyperventilation, but it is still possible to have hypoxia at a low altitude. It's just really, really uncommon. So remedies. Preemptive remedies would be avoiding hypoxic altitudes. Don't smoke. Limit your physical activity. Avoid flying when you're sick or in an elevated emotional state, because in those situations your body is consuming more oxygen. It's metabolizing that oxygen so that you'll get better or your brain can think in those elevated states. Also, you want to be able to fly in a pressurized cabin if possible, or fly with supplemental oxygen. So how do we react to hypoxia? You would treat these symptoms, or hopefully before you get to those symptoms, before they're too severe. You would use supplemental oxygen if you weren't already using it. And if you're already using it, consider using a higher flow if that's available to you. If you have a pressurized cabin, ensure that it's functioning properly, and then descend to a lower altitude, 10,000 feet or the highest IFR safe altitude. I would recommend doing them in that order because the oxygen is going to be what's keeping your body from experiencing that hypoxia, and then check the pressurization system if you have it, and then down to a lower altitude if that's not resolved either. That's kind of like a priorities of work, an approach to how you should do that because of how vital oxygen is to our cognitive thought process. Something that I thought was interesting in the textbook was called the oxygen paradox. Something that I hadn't heard of before, but I think it's really neat, that you'll get a decrease in blood pressure and an increase in symptom severity for approximately 60 seconds going to a hypoxic state to breathing oxygen. And that's because of a prolonged hypoxic state and compensatory stage, that your body is going from this compensating effect to now, okay, this is what I want. And it's still struggling with that transition because that oxygen is immediate and the body's response to it is not. But you would want to continue to breathe that oxygen, and it should subside after about 60 seconds. That was my presentation. These are the references that I used in the slideshow. I look forward to your feedback, and thanks. Have a great week.